Good morning and welcome to the 6th National DRANZSEN Forum. My name is Amanda Leck and I'm the Executive Director of the Australian Institute for Disaster Resilience. Before I continue, I wish to start by acknowledging that I'm hosting this event from the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. I also acknowledge the traditional custodians of the various lands on which you all join us from today and the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people participating in this event. I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and celebrate the diversity of Aboriginal peoples and their ongoing cultures and connections to the lands and waters across Australia. This is the second year in which AIDA is running the National DRANZSEN Forum online. In 2020, AIDA transitioned the forum into an online format due to the COVID-19 restrictions. A silver lining for this is that the change has allowed for more people to attend the event than in previous years and made it more inclusive and accessible than ever before. We are excited to have people joining us today from across every Australian state and territory and international attendees from Canada, New Zealand, Indonesia and Sri Lanka. So welcome to everyone. The presenters that you will hear from today come from a wide range of backgrounds and industries, but share a common goal: the advancement of disaster resilience education for young people and supporting communities to reduce risks associated with national hazards. Our presentation topics for today are on DRE's potential to facilitate the increase of women in STEM, or science, technology, education and mathematics, interactive technologies and how they can support young people to learn about emergency situations, how youth voice can be amplified after disasters have occurred, an international perspective on DRE from Japan, how the growing frequency and intensity of natural hazards is increasing the need for young people to become more resilient, and finally, the importance of learner agency. We are also very lucky to have a talented Victorian musician with us today, Hannah Cooper, who will be joining us to discuss her experiences of growing up in a bushfire-prone area and how music can play a role to help individuals and communities to heal. We will also provide you with an overview of the AIDA Education for Young People program and share with you some exciting things on the horizon for the latter part of 2021 and early 2022. In addition to the DRANZSEN Forum, the Disaster Resilience Education for Young People Handbook launch is taking place this afternoon at 1 p.m, and I hope you will also join us for that session. We will hear from the author Neil Dufty and a whole range of other key contributors to that handbook project. I would like to thank you all for being part of our ever-growing and diverse network of more than 800 members involved in DRANZSEN from right across Australia and New Zealand. The work that you do in supporting young people to reduce risk and participate in resilient communities is truly inspiring. And now I will pass you over to Owen Zabel from AIDA to facilitate the rest of the forum. Thank you very much.
Good morning, and thank you, Amanda, for opening today's forum. I'll introduce our first presentation shortly. Before I do, I'd like to provide you with some brief housekeeping. So today's event will be recorded and made available along with presentation slides after the event. Today we'll be using the Q&A feature on Zoom to take questions. So please post your questions in the Q&A box, not the chat window. And we will endeavour for presenters to answer your questions when they're able to do so. And if we have time, be able to do that actually via a conversation at the end of their presentations. You're able to upvote questions by clicking the thumbs up button, and I'll do my best to ask these to our speakers following their presentations. I encourage you to use the chat window to share your thoughts or reflections during the presentations. And just a reminder that you'll need to select all panelists and attendees in the drop-down menu for everyone attending today to view your messages. I'd like to also remind you to please be respectful to each other and our presenters when posting your comments and questions. So as Amanda kindly introduced me, my name is Owen. I am from AIDA, and I'd like to also welcome you to our 6th National DRANZSEN Forum. First and foremost, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which I come to the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. I pay my respects to the elders past, present and emerging, and celebrate the diversity of Aboriginal peoples and their ongoing cultures and connections to the lands and waters across Australia. Next slide, please. So it's wonderful to see the DRANZSEN network continuing to grow, such a diverse network, and we are very excited to say that we have just gotten over 700 members as of our last count. As many of you know, DRANZSEN aims to increase awareness and understanding of disaster resilience education within the education sector, building capacity for anyone involved in the education of young people to teach and support young people to take action before, during, and after an emergency, and to foster the growth of young people to become active participants in their local communities. Today's event is a wonderful opportunity for us to build capacity and share good practice. We have some fantastic speakers from across the network who are going to share their experiences of working with young people. For those of you who are new to the realm of disaster resilience education, disaster resilience education is learning about natural hazards in the local environment and the ways to keep communities safe from harm before, during, and after an emergency or disaster. It's about enabling young people with knowledge, skills, and confidence to take a proactive action before, during, and after an emergency or disaster. Young people are key to increasing community resilience, and we recognise them as agents of change, empowering their communities, working to reduce the risks associated with natural hazards. The work that we at ADA do links to not only the National Disaster Risk Reduction Framework, but also the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction and many others. Next slide, please. ADA continues to maintain a large range of online educational resources on its website, both those developed by ADA and those developed by other agencies and institutions, and we value sharing knowledge. ADA recently partnered with Cool Australia, a leading educational resource company, to develop a suite of lesson plans and resources to be used in schools. The lesson plans align with current Australian curriculum for years 7 to 8 in science, humanities, art, health and physical education. The lessons in the unit are designed to inform students about natural hazards in the local environment and the ways to reduce risks, prepare, respond and recover from a disaster emergency, and are underpinned by the principles set out in the Disaster Resilience Education for Young People Handbook. As of the start of September, the lessons have been viewed over 1,274 times, downloaded over 660 times, and had 162 unique teacher downloads. And from the research that Cool Australia does, those unique downloads equate to 21,546 students being taught with the resources. So it's wonderful to see the vast amount of students that can be that are exposed to these resources. In addition to the work done with Cool Australia, ADA has also supported style education to incorporate DRE into their recently updated units of work on plate tectonics and geomorphological hazards. Style education's resources are currently used in over 40% of all schools across Australia, and they're currently being introduced into both New Zealand and United States schools. Today, September 1st, is Indigenous Literacy Day in Australia as well, and ADA is currently in the process of developing website pages dedicated to sharing amazing DRE resources and information for ATSI, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander and KELD, culturally and linguistically diverse communities. ADA, next slide, please. ADA, supported by DRESIG and the wider DRANZSEN network, also took part in the 2021 Australian Curriculum Review, ACARA, called for submissions to the proposed curriculum, launching next year in 2022. And ADA lobbied for DRE to be mandated in the curriculum throughout, through the addition of new subject descriptors and for existing descriptors that allow for DRE to be integrated into the classroom, that ACARA proposes to remove, be retained. 2021, like 2020, has been heavily impacted by COVID restrictions across Australia. The ongoing impact of the pandemic has resulted in ADA reassessing how DRANZSEN events can occur. There have been a positive shift to online forums, as Amanda mentioned previously, seeing an increase in attendance rates from those who would otherwise have not been able to attend in-person forums. At present count, and I'll just have a quick look, we're at 84 attendees today, which is wonderful. We had over 160 people registered to attend, so hopefully some more can join us as we go along. Next slide, please. As a result of this positive uptake in online forums, ADA will introduce 2 new forums in the latter part of 2021 and early 2022. These are a teachers forum and a youth forum. I will, however, go into more detail about those at the end of the forum. And next slide, please. Finally, we are proud to announce that the Australian Emergency Management Library has been moved to ADA's East Melbourne office, and borrowing processes are currently being finalised. Since opening in 1956, the library has grown into one of the largest of its kind in Australia, providing services to universities, local government, individuals, and the emergency management sector. Content spans themes including disaster recovery and business continuity, leadership skills, and effective management. The library houses resources of national interest and significance and makes these available by interlibrary loans across Australia. Next slide, please. But that is enough from me. So we're very lucky to have Victorian musician Hannah Cooper with us today. Before she joins us to discuss her music and its connection to the realm of DRE, we would like to play a snippet from her recently released song, The Fire Song.
My friend, she told me she was scared of the summer, not of the flowers, just of the temperature. And if we gotta leave, what in the hell would we take? Photo albums, defense against the heat wave, shadows on the drive home. Golden, but it don't feel so golden anymore. And the colors, they were bleeding bright. 'Cause now all that remains is the colors of the night. As it went up in fire, in fire, in fire. It went up in fire, in fire, in fire. But it's not enough to wish for rain this time. What's it gonna do? Leave us shackled with rains this time. Like empty promises, go ahead, deny the truth of the matter. Are you blind? It's not enough to wish for rain this time. No rain, 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 no rain this time. No rain. Well, my friend, she told me she gon' move to the Arctic, where low fire danger gon' keep her company. But if she's gonna leave, well, who in the world will I talk to? And anyway, the icebergs are gonna melt soon.
Brilliant, thank you very much. And I would now like to introduce Hannah, who's very gratefully given us some time to have a quick chat. Are you there, Hannah?
Hey.
There you are. How's it going, Hannah?
Good, how are you?
I'm very well, thank you. So first and foremost, thank you so much for joining us today. We'd love the opportunity to be able to speak to you about your song. And so I guess the best place to start is, can you tell us about your background?
Yeah, so our family is quite musical. Lots of grandparents that are like, not lots of grandparents, only 4 of them actually, but I've got a pianist grandmother, a grandfather that played violin, and then we had a lot of like family sessions with other families all having instruments going on. So yeah, just like a really nice environment to make music.
It's wonderful. It's wonderful. It sounds like the complete opposite, I think, of my family. I don't think I've got a musical bone in my body whatsoever. But what led you to write and record this song, and what was the process like?
I think it was the amount of footage in the media that we saw as a family and obviously as a country of the fires, first in Queensland and then New South Wales. And we often holiday camp in Malakuta, so that was difficult to see. We had friends that lost a house there. So yeah, we weren't directly affected, but could see it going on. And so as with every song I write, I'm inspired by what happens around me, kind of common themes that keep happening that I'm like, oh, okay, what's going on here? And this particular song started when my friend in year 12 was having a conversation to me, and she said that she got really scared during the summer. And so I began to write a verse around that, which turned into the song. And I continued the story, exaggerated a bit in verse 2, because she goes to the Arctic to escape the fires. That didn't happen. But yeah, it was kind of connecting icebergs melting, because at this point in time, climate change is this inescapably recurring factor of environmental collapse. And I played with different sounds of the environment as well, recording kookaburras from my home in Woodend and putting them at the beginning. And then also I created this initial beat with frog sounds from my aunt's house in St Andrews after this really big storm. Yeah, so the idea was kind of to connect the song to country and to animals, because the whole world suffers when we do nothing about climate change.
Yeah, it's wonderful to hear, that you were able to incorporate those the natural sounds and the kookaburras and the frogs into it. It's lovely to sort of, when we first spoke and you told me about that, I hadn't realised, and then going back and listening to it, it's so they fit so perfectly. And I guess you've mentioned obviously the change in climate that's happening at the moment. And what role does music have, do you think, for to play in people or communities' lives, maybe either being resilient or recovering in these kind of events?
I think music is really fundamental to bringing everyone together through shared experiences or shared trauma, maybe in this case with disasters. And there's been great songs in the past, like Kev Carmody and Paul Kelly's From Little Things, Big Things Grow, or USA for Africa's We Are the World, or even last year when Melbourne was at height lockdown period, Greta Ray, who's another Victorian artist, released a song called Better Now, and that was really just giving people hope that it will get better. So my aim for the song was really just to generate awareness to people less affected by fires that communities are still recovering. It's a really long process and it doesn't happen overnight. And for people that are directly affected, that they're not alone and people are standing with them. Yeah.
It's wonderful you've been able to sort of to raise awareness for these in such an amazing way. And what's the response been like since releasing it? And why did you choose to wait a year after the fires to release the song?
Well, the response has been really great. It's the first song I've ever released. My mum really wanted me to finally get something out there. I wrote it a year before, so January 2020. Could have released it then, but it just really wasn't really finished. But yeah, the idea behind releasing a year after was just to bring that awareness that a year after people are still recovering. And people have had quite emotional responses to the song. They've told me as a kind of release, people that have been directly affected have said how much it meant to them. Because I imagine if you've been through something so disruptive, the music kind of just brings people together, it connects them. Yeah, so yeah, they've said they've loved it. It's been a good response, I guess. Yeah.
Oh, that's brilliant. That's great to hear. And one of those points that you said, it brings people together, and so often after these traumatic events, it's so important for those to reestablish those community connections. What would you like people to take away from your song?
I think ultimately the song is a call to climate action. I initially wrote a chorus and decided that it wasn't working, so wrote a new chorus. And the one that I've ended up with, It's Not Enough to Wish for Rain, I think is like the main idea, because we can't expect that the earth will keep sustaining itself amidst all our destructive behaviour. And wishing for rain is kind of this band-aid solution to a broader problem that I find a lot of policy and decision making reflects, this band-aid solution idea. So I think ultimately there needs to be a real commitment to getting rid of our global emissions and working alongside the earth rather than in this defensive way, seeing humans at the top of the hierarchy. Yeah, so the song illustrates the common stories of packing up, evacuating, thinking ahead. And as a young person, I've been doing this for majority of my life, and it really only gets worse at this point every summer. So many of us know the science behind climate change, and we just have to act. And so I think wishing for rain is merely empty words at this point. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm hopeful that people can take that message away. And just one last question, I guess. What do you think young people can bring to the conversation when it comes to working on climate change and natural hazards and associated risks?
Yeah, I'm not the spokesperson for every young person in Australia, but I think the most important thing is just to involve young people from all different backgrounds, particularly Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, and others that just don't seem to have a voice. There's been really great examples of this beginning in Australia, such as SEED, the Australian Indigenous Youth Climate Network. And I see a lot of programs at university currently where students are banding together. So I don't think I'm alone in saying that I'm worried about the future. I think it's also important not to burden young people with the problem. But I wonder what will the world be like in 20 or 40 years. And it's a short period of time, but I hope that some big changes can happen. I think young people can bring hope, but it needs to be understood that we're very aware of the extremity of the situation, and every day of inaction by current leadership just makes it harder for our future and future generations.
I think there's a couple of things that you've touched on there is really important, and that young people do provide hope, and they do provide a unique perspective when it comes to dealing with issues of climate change and natural hazards and developing resilient communities. So I'd like to thank you very much, Hannah, for taking the time to speak with us. Before we do end, I would just like to give you the opportunity. Where can people find out more about your music, and is there anything else coming up on the horizon?
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. It's been really great to talk. There will be more on the horizon. It's just a matter of finishing it, I guess. You can find me on YouTube with this video. I think there's potentially some links that have been put in the chat.
Yep, we've got links in the chat. Yep.
And on Instagram is where all the music kind of gets promoted, I guess. So yeah, hopefully soon there will be more. Yeah.
Brilliant. Well, thank you so much, Hannah. We really appreciate you taking the time out of your busy uni schedule to join us. And yeah, if anyone else would like to check out the full version song, it's up on YouTube or
and Spotify.
And there are links in the chat for you to check it out. So thank you so much, Hannah. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you.
All right, thanks, Hannah. Cheers. Brilliant. I would now like to pass over to Ella from ADA to speak about the Disaster Resilience Education for Young People's Handbook.
Hi all, my name's Ella Wilkinson and I'm a project officer here at ADA working in the handbooks team. Firstly, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm meeting you from the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation here in Naarm, otherwise known as Melbourne, and I pay my respects to the elders past, present and emerging. Today I have the pleasure to announce that ADA's inaugural Disaster Resilience Education for Young People Handbook has been endorsed to become a part of the Australian Disaster Resilience Handbook collection. So in this session today, I'll give you a brief overview of the context of the handbook, its development, scope and purpose. Next slide. For a deeper dive into the handbook and its principles and how these principles can be seen in practice, tune into our handbook launch showcase webinar with our esteemed writer Neil Dufty and 2 working group members. So Dr. Andrea Baldwin from the Queensland Centre of Perinatal and Infant Mental Health and Leslie King from the Tasmania Fire Service. They'll provide case studies, and you'll also have the opportunity to ask questions in the Q&A session. Next slide. To give you some context on where the handbook sits, as I mentioned, it's part of the broader Australian Disaster Resilience Handbook collection. This collection supports the implementation of the National Disaster Risk Reduction Framework by providing national principles and high-level guidance to strengthen the resilience of Australian communities to disaster. So these handbooks really provide a national focal point to coordinate, develop, and endorse national principles that really set that standard for good practice of disaster risk reduction and resilience in Australia. Next slide. The Disaster Resilience Education for Young People Handbook, or what from now on I'll call the DRE Handbook, was developed throughout 2020 and 2021 through a process of national consultation with subject matter experts from a cross-section of stakeholders in Australia. So this is across education, disaster resilience, emergency management services and agencies, humanitarian organisations, health and research institutions. We also engaged Neil Dufty of Melino Stewart as the writer of the handbook. So many of our working group members were involved through the DRANZSEN network, and we also, the Disaster Resilience Education Strategy Group, or DRESEG, were consulted to provide that strategic guidance and governance oversight of the project. Another important element of the consultation process for this project was the establishment of a youth reference group who met to discuss drafts and also provided their own written feedback on throughout the drafting process. So the working group, DRESEG, and the youth reference group met by video conference throughout the year, providing formal feedback and review on 4 separate drafts. And through this process, they consulted within their organisations and wider networks. So this really, what we have is a final product of a handbook that really provides an authoritative, trusted source of knowledge of disaster resilience education for young people in Australia. Next slide. The purpose of the handbook is to provide that high-level principle-based guidance for those seeking to engage young people in learning and action for disaster risk reduction and resilience. So as we know, it's through participation in education that young people can act as agents of change. But the handbook also notes that concept of a shared responsibility, and that DRE takes place in the context of broader strategic policy and action, setting that strategic policy in the handbook of the National Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction, the Comprehensive School Safety Framework, the Sendai Framework, the SDGs, and the National Education Declaration. So the handbook outlines the high-level principles, approaches, and core elements of effective DRE for young people, but it also provides strategies and examples to design, implement, and evaluate learning programs and initiatives for young people. The young people can obviously encompass a lot of people. It's quite a broad term, with the UN defining young people from 0 to 25. But the focus of this handbook really is preschool and school-age children and adolescents, with the principles and strategies of learning and teaching applicable to that broader definition of young people. In terms of learning settings, the handbook focuses on early learning, primary and secondary education settings, as well as community settings, so for example, Scouts. The handbook was developed to support registered teachers, educators, executive and leadership teams in schools and early learning centres, organisations engaging with schools and early learning communities, and organisations engaging with young people in other learning settings, but also policymakers in education settings. The handbook is informed by contemporary research and also underpinned by over a decade of research from Australia and around the world, demonstrating that DRE really is highly valued by students and can deliver a wide range of benefits for young people, their families, and the broader community. Next slide, please. I'm just going to go over the principles very briefly, but the key principles include supporting inclusion, placing the learner at the centre, reflecting the local context and focusing on action and connection in the learning process. The handbook also strongly promotes the principle of establishing and strengthening DRE partnerships, such as those between schools and emergency management agencies. Next slide, please. To really illustrate the claims made in the handbook, working group members provided case studies and examples to bring these principles and strategic guidance to life. So it was important that these examples span ages of young people, learning settings and hazards. And in the handbook launch showcase webinar, you will hear all about Birdie's Tree and Disaster Resilience Education Tasmania in further detail. And another way of bringing the handbook to life was through quotes from actual students and teachers that have been collected throughout recent research projects kindly provided by Bryony Towers. Next slide, please. So throughout the process of developing the handbook, many working group members identified the need for practical tools and resources. So to support the high-level principle-based guidance of the handbook and to support the implementation of the handbook, as Owen mentioned earlier, ADA worked with Cool Australia to develop practical teaching resources. And as Owen highlighted, these resources are STEM-focused lessons that have been designed for Year 7 and 8, geography, science, civics, but they're also scalable for upper primary and middle secondary. And they're now freely available online to download from the Cool Australia website. You can also find them from the DRE handbook collection page. Next slide, please. So that's a very brief overview of the process of how the handbook was developed and what you'll find in ADA's inaugural handbook on disaster resilience education for young people. As I've mentioned a couple of times, we do have our launch of the handbook where you'll hear from subject matter experts and hear them unpack these concepts and principles in further detail. And if you can't make it to the launch, we'll also be posting the webinar on the handbook collection page in the following week. Next slide. And finally, I'd just like to thank all of the individuals and organisations involved in the development of the handbook, the working group members, DREZEG, Youth Reference Group, and our writer Neil Dufty, just for all of their time and enormous efforts over the past year. It really takes a lot to pull these handbooks together. And as I mentioned, the handbook is now freely available to download online. The link is up on the screen, and print copies will be available to purchase soon. If you'd like to be notified when you can purchase a copy, please get in contact with me. If you want any further details about the handbook, you can send me an email. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Ella. We really appreciate you giving us a rundown of that, and we're excited to see how the handbook launch goes this afternoon. And I encourage everyone to join us if you're able to do so. I would now like everyone to welcome our next two speakers today, discussing what about children, amplifying children's voices and natural resilience after disaster. We have Dani Brunton, the Emergency Response Manager from Save the Children Australia, and Reem Hasib, Operational Manager, New South Wales, Victoria, South Australia for Save the Children. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. I would like to just thank the team at ADA for inviting Save the Children to present at the DRANZSEN Forum today. And before I start, I would also like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri people, the traditional custodians of the land I am presenting from today, and pay my respects to the elders past and present. I extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples at the forum today. So at Save the Children, we ask the question, what about the children? To answer this, Reem, Hasib and I will take the opportunity to present our two main disaster recovery programs, Journey of Hope and Our Voice. Next slide, please. Save the Children is an international NGO dedicated to working for the needs of children around the world, particularly when times get really tough during and after disasters. In Australia, we achieve this through the core suite of programs on this slide. These programs are tailored to support children's psychosocial and emotional needs throughout the trauma recovery continuum. We provide support at all stages, but we'll focus our short presentation today on just 2 of these programs highlighted on the slide. Over the past year and a half since the 2019-2020 Black Summer bushfires, Save the Children has been supporting impacted children and communities in the early and longer term recovery phase through the delivery of Journey of Hope and Our Voice. Each service has been independently evaluated with findings that demonstrate positive impact. Next slide, please. Journey of Hope is an evidence-based program that was originally designed in response to Hurricane Katrina in the US in 2005. It was designed in collaboration with children and psychologists and has been evaluated a number of times to ensure it is delivering on the desired impact for children. It has been delivered internationally in various countries, including the UK, New Zealand, the Ukraine, Canada, and the US. Even with our delivery of the program here in Australia, although we made minor cultural adaptations for our context, we maintained clear fidelity with the proven evidence base. The program is delivered in schools over an 8-week period and is strengths-based, utilising art and play therapy. Delivered in small groups of 8 to 10 children from either primary or secondary school, and is a universal program, so it's distinctive from programs that require medical referral or proof of loss from disaster. The program focuses on helping children to understand and normalise their emotions, develop positive coping mechanisms, and rebuild their resilience for the future. Indirectly, it achieves a reduction in conduct problems, improves concentration, and promotes positive peer relationships. Next slide. Since June 2020, we delivered Journey of Hope to over 5,000 children across New South Wales and Victoria. We received a lot of positive feedback from children, parents, and teachers who were involved in the program. Some of it you can see here on the slide if you've got really good eyesight. For example, one student said, "I've learnt how to manage feelings and I've learnt how to make it leave if it is a bad feeling." We could see from many other examples like this one that the program was able to steer children onto positive paths at the early stage of recovery. Research shows that leaving trauma go untreated, even at a point where it may appear to be just slight behaviour change, can result in longer term mental health problems and impact a child's emotional and academic trajectory. Next slide, please. We conducted an external evaluation of the program, the findings of which are being released in the next few weeks. Students reported an improvement in how they face difficulties in their daily lives, improvement of their relationships with others, and a greater use of positive coping strategies. These outcomes also contributed to a more positive classroom and home environments. I'd like to share a short story that shows tangibly what these outcomes look like. We worked with a boy who was about 10 years old, who was caught up in the bushfires in New South Wales and stayed with his family to fight to keep their grandparents home. It had been in their family for years, so they had a deep connection to it. Unfortunately, they couldn't save it and it went up in flames. When this boy went back to school, he was full of anger. He couldn't understand why his family had lost their home while others had not. Whenever he got sad, it would erupt as anger and aggression towards his friends, and these precious relationships started to break down. Whilst participating in our program, he learnt that being sad was normal and okay. He was able to let himself cry after accepting that crying was not weakness. He learnt ways to deal with his sadness before it turned into anger and aggression, and was able to rebuild his close social bonds with his friends. Giving children this toolkit is so important. They're able to build their emotional literacy so they can understand their emotions and communicate their needs. And at the same time, they have the knowledge and skills to cope better with what they are facing in life. When they start to feel negative feelings arising, such as fear or anxiety, they know what they need to do to regulate their emotions. The evaluation confirms the importance of universal psychosocial support and emotional wellbeing programs being offered in school, especially in the aftermath of a community-wide trauma. Next slide, please. The story I just shared of this boy was only one of so many similar stories, and our evaluation results echoed this. Of our evaluation participants, 90% stated that the program helped them learn how to manage their feelings. 79% said they had practiced the positive coping techniques that they had learnt, and 70% had talked to an adult recently about their feelings. We are so proud of being a part of the recovery journey for these 5,000 children. Although their journeys will continue, they are a bit better placed to cope with whatever comes next, such as, I don't know, a global pandemic. One final outcome from the evaluation I would like to note was the importance of creating safe space, both physically and emotionally, for children to be able to open up and be vulnerable. After experiencing an event like the bushfires that in many cases destroyed precious connections with safe places like homes and bushland around them, this component came out strongly in our evaluation. The program is delivered in school, as this is considered by most children as a trusted and safe place. For most kids, it is the centre of the world outside their home. Schools play such an important role in recovery. Additionally, the importance of the student-facilitator relationship was noted as a component in the success of the program. Although the program was delivered in the familiar and safe surrounds of the school, having specially trained facilitators who could create safe spaces where children felt safe and unjudged was identified by students, parents, and teachers as a key component for the program's impact. Just as dedicated psychosocial support programs are critical to children's recovery after a community trauma, it is also important that children are given the chance to be heard, their experiences acknowledged, and the agency to participate in decision-making that affects them directly. We offer this opportunity for healing through our participation program, Our Voice, which Reem will now present. Thank you, and next slide, please.
Thank you, Dani. Our Voice is Save the Children Australia's flagship child participation program. It is delivered post-disaster and is based on Article 12, Respect for Children's Views from the Convention on the Rights of the Child. Save the Children's unique approach to child participation is based on the 9 basic requirements listed here. This approach was developed in consultation with young people and is based on almost 30 years of experience delivering child participation initiatives across the globe. Child participation to us is about ensuring children and young people have the opportunity to express their views, have these views taken seriously, and influence decision-making. Next slide, please. Our Voice supports local councils and decision makers to engage with children, enabling them to become powerful agents of change and influence local emergency plans. So why did we develop Our Voice? Children have expressed to us that they are frustrated that their capacity to help with rebuilding and preparing for future disasters has not been tapped into. There's good evidence that children's involvement in disaster response improves the quality and effectiveness of emergency planning by introducing fresh ideas and experiences. It empowers children to champion change in their local community, persuading others to act and ensuring resources are targeted and effective for their peers. It boosts individual protective factors like increased confidence, self-esteem, and positive coping skills. And it also increases accountability for children. Next slide, please. Our Voice sessions are delivered by trained facilitators over 4 stages: connect, co-design, create, and communicate. During the connect phase, young participants sign up to be champions of change in their community and learn about their rights and what meaningful participation looks like. Facilitators also train adults on the 9 basic requirements. During the co-design phase, young participants safely share their perspectives of emergencies, then create their own goals and aspirations for the project. Through a co-design process, a local participation roadmap is produced. For the create phase, young participants explore roles and responsibilities of both children and adults in emergencies. Ideas and solutions are discussed, recommendations for decision makers are crafted, and local events or plans are designed. And finally, during the communicate phase, young participants share their recommendations to decision makers in the community more broadly and receive feedback on these ideas. Next slide, please. We delivered Our Voice to 7 bushfire-affected communities in New South Wales and Victoria. A number of themes and recommendations were consistently raised. 1, understanding emergency management helps young people feel prepared and safe. 2, official communication during disasters needs to be in simple, child-friendly language and made available via channels which are accessible and reliable. 3, Communities must provide safe places for young people to gather and connect both during and after emergencies. And finally, more opportunities should be created for children to be involved in recovery processes like volunteering. Next slide, please. In addition to those specific emergency-related recommendations, we also heard that overall children want more opportunities to have a say on issues that matter to them. They need their own spaces in the community where they can gather and have fun in a safe and relaxed setting. And finally, there is a strong demand for increased mental health and well-being services for young people, which are delivered ideally through schools. Next slide, please. We delivered Our Voice in Taree, New South Wales, where participants decided to host a meeting to share their ideas with Mid-Coast Council members. And this is just one example of what Our Voice looks like in practice. During this meeting, we've heard from a young person who shared how scary the fires were for them because they had a sibling who was home alone with no access to information on how to evacuate or even a car. There were more examples like this. It's these experiences that have formed the recommendations, which included using schools to teach students how to prepare a bushfire plan, and also ensuring there are designated safe spaces for young people during disasters. To close off, we have a short video to share with you from Taree. Thank you so much for your time and for having us today. Please play the video.
This is the Our Voice project, and I think that sums it up pretty well. It was basically about telling the community and telling the people that are in charge of the decision-making process in the community our voice and what we thought about the natural disasters. But I think that's what's so important about these events, that we are able to talk to people that are in those decision-making positions and they can tell us how we can be involved, because we do want to.
So the Our Voice program was set as a program to empower children and young people to be able to make a meaningful difference to the rehabilitation and the rebuilding of their communities post-recovery and disaster. So the bushfires were a really difficult time for children and young people, especially because there wasn't a lot of communication. And then following the fires came the floods, and all this was under the backdrop of COVID-19, so it was a cumulative disaster, so it was a lot for children and young people to take on.
The Our Voice program, it really sets out to model what good and meaningful participation can look like, to bring together young people and key decision makers in really meaningful two-way learning.
The majority of the community consultation that's happened around recovery has been with adults in the community, so the learning exchange I think is key to providing a platform for that conversation to happen, because without it we're not really engaging with young people in any other way.
Today we did Our Voice project learning exchange with the Mid-Coast Council team. It was nerve-wracking at first because it was a bunch of people I really hadn't met before, but it was good to have my team beside me, and once we got going it was nice to have my voice heard, which was an experience I really hadn't had in our community before.
One thing I'm holding on to after the presentation today is I'm really inspired by the young people in our area. I think we've got some really strong leaders, and I feel like they had an amazing opportunity today to step up, and they did that.
The audience and the people that we were presenting to were so engaging and so respectful and just so wonderful to speak to. They made this place like a conversation, and we were hoping for that, but when it came through, that was amazing.
Having a voice means I get the opportunity to share my opinion in my community, which is very small, and it's very hard to have your voice heard, but when you do, I feel like it has a great impact.
Thank you, Dani, and thank you, Reem. It's wonderful to hear all the amazing work that Save the Children has been doing around Australia, in particular post 2019-20 bushfires. There are a couple of questions that have been put up into the question and answer box. Just mindful of time, we don't unfortunately have time for Reem and Dani to answer those questions live, but they will be able to type out their answers to Samantha and to Judith who have asked those questions. But now I would actually like to introduce our next speaker, Mirzaei, a PhD candidate from Queensland University of Technology. And she'll be discussing her research on interaction design technology for children to learn safe behaviour in natural emergency situations. Over to you, Mehrnoosh.
Hello everyone, my name is Mehrnoosh Mirzaei and I'm doing my PhD in Industrial Design in Queensland University of Technology. Today I'm going to talk about my research, which is interaction design technology for children, and how these kinds of technology help children to be more prepared and actively involved in disaster education. I'm going to talk about some part of my research design and also some part of my result as well. Thank you so much. Children are considered a vulnerable group when disaster strikes. Between 30 to 50% of deaths in natural disaster worldwide are in this demographic group. According to the World Disaster Report in 2001, about 66.5 million children were victims of natural hazards each year, and it is estimated that this number will increase to 175 million per year due to recent environmental change and global warming. The degree and nature of hazards has changed due to climate change, and new natural hazard scenario needs new skill. Therefore, new methods for disaster education for children should be developed that improve the adoption of practical safe behavior during natural emergencies with the focus on problem solving and creative decision making during the risk. Learning through experiencing the subject of risk and safe behavior is an effective educational approach in disaster preparation activities for children. Why developing a new approach is important? The current school-based disaster risk reduction education mainly provides theoretical knowledge of risk and natural hazards, and most of the disaster risk reduction activity are based on the printed materials. How can we help children to be more prepared during natural risk and be more confident on those situations? By providing a chance to experiencing the subject of the risk through active involvement in the activity. According to embodiment theory, the body and brain are not separate entities in the cognition process, and we understand and make meaning through our action. When situations demand fast and continuously evolving responses, there may simply not be time to build up actually developmental model of the environment from which to drive a plan of action. When humans are confronted with model complex tasks under time pressure, unplanned reactions come into play and performance suffers. With practice, though, new skills become automatized, reducing cognitive load and circumventing the unplanned reaction or representational bottleneck. To achieve this theory of embodiment has used in this research. According to embodiment, collaboration with other people and objects also play an important role on our cognition process. The research objectives are to understand children's active meaning making of disaster situation in scenario-based events through their body and interaction with the environment and physical objects. To develop a framework of embodiment learning factors for disaster preparation based on children's active learning and disaster to perform and inform designers. To observe the aspects of embodiment children's interaction with the environment that facilitates problem solving and decision-making activities in time pressure situations. This research comprised of 4 studies, survey, interview, and 2 activity workshops with children. As a child-led research, children were involved in the earliest stage of the research, and as they played an informant role to inform design decisions. Observational study has been conducted in the form of workshop activities for children. The first activity workshops were designed based on the result of survey and interview with experts. According to the result, real-life scenario is considered one of the effective learning approaches among practitioners and teachers. Real-life stories involving children in scenario-based activities may lead to more engagement in the process of safe behavior and knowledge making for them. In the first activity workshop, children were involved in a local hazard scenario, which was bushfire, and helped a koala to get to a safe place through a maze. In the process, the way children perceive risk in a time pressure situation that involve creative decision-making and problem-solving were observed. According to the result, priority of children during natural hazard was saving their life. This perception leads to being fast and going to a fight and flight mode. However, embodiment and bodily experiencing give them a chance to practice problem-solving and decision-making skills during risk. For finding about the detail of embodiment, different aspects of embodiment, such as participatory meaning-making, real-world and real-time, was observed in each activity workshop. Based on the result of first workshop, participatory meaning-making, achievement, and decision-making were among the most dominant aspects in the workshop activities. So, focusing on achievement and decision-making could lead to engagement to children while they are learning about disaster and preparedness. The second activity workshop was developed based on some results of the first activity workshop. Children were involved in a local natural hazards. Flooding and storms are two main and the most repetitive natural hazards in South Queensland. Children helped a koala to get to a safe place through a maze and pick the necessary items for her. In the process, they have faced many challenges related to that emergency situation, which need decision-making and problem-solving, such as power outage and tuning a radio. Workshops number 2 comprise of the 3 phases: 1, planning, 2, experiencing of the subject of the risk through their actively involvement, and 3, reflection. Reflection is one of the important parts of cognition process, which is active and conscious, and it happens during a problem-solving task. In these workshop sessions, reflection happened on 2 phases: reflection in action, which happened during the activity, and reflection on action, which happened after the activity, and during the interview and retrospective interview with children. In future results, different aspects of embodiment will be analyzed in both reflection phases. The result of this research will be a child-centered framework based on embodied interaction principle and primary school children's active learning needs regarding disaster preparation activities to inform designers. A set of guidelines that will inform disaster instructors to design child-centered disaster risk reduction activities, and workshops can inspire future disaster curriculum programs and provide a new perspective for delivering disaster preparedness message. Thank you.
Thank you, Mehrnoosh. It's wonderful to hear the research that is taking place, because obviously the amazing work that's done by some of these organisations really benefits from that research that you're doing. So thank you so much, and thank you for taking the time to be able to present to us today.
Hi, yeah, thank you. No worries. Thank you for having me to this amazing forum. Yeah, and I'm really happy that presenting my work and actually like hearing the children's voice in terms of disaster education.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much. We really appreciate it, and we look forward to seeing the final results of your PhD, hopefully in the not too distant future. Thank you so much.
Thank you. No worries. Thank you so much.
I'd now like to welcome our next presenter, Beth Yokohara, the Director of Wanavi Japan, and she'll be discussing the work that Wanavi Japan does in earthquake preparedness in Japan and giving us an international perspective from disaster resilience for disaster resilience education. Over to you, Beth.
Thank you so much. Hello, and thank you for inviting me to speak to you today. First of all, I'd like to acknowledge and pay respects to the Kaurna people, the traditional custodians of the lands I am presenting from. I acknowledge the deep feelings of attachment and relationship of the Kaurna people to country and pay respects to elders past, present and emerging. So my name is Beth Yokohara and I am a director for Wanavi Japan. I lived in Japan for 14 years and was in Japan in 2011 for the Great East Japan earthquake and tsunami related disaster. At that time, I was a new mum with a 5-month baby and I'd lived in Japan for 4 years already. But despite this, I was completely unprepared for an earthquake like this and found myself struggling to know what to do. So Wanavi Japan is a non-profit organisation. We came together just after the 2011 Great East Japan earthquake in the hopes of doing something to support the people of Tohoku. Many of us had small children at that time, and it was difficult for us to go directly to the affected areas. And we realised, however, that it wasn't just the people of Tohoku or the Northeast region who needed support. Many international residents, particularly parents of small children, were under a lot of stress due to a lack of information and support in their own languages. So we put together a small charity earthquake preparedness workshop to empower international residents with earthquake literacy and to help them be prepared for a disaster. And I attended this very first workshop and I've been working with Wanavi ever since. So we provide earthquake preparedness workshops with the aim of empowering international residents to live confidently and comfortably in Japan. And every year we hold a standalone charity workshop open to everyone, commemorating the anniversary of the Great East Japan earthquake in March. And this year we commemorated the 10th anniversary. We run our workshops with different organisations like ward offices, community groups, embassies, companies, organisations, universities, schools and preschools. And we work with these groups to tailor our workshops to suit the needs of the different groups. And since 2020, in response to the COVID pandemic, we continue to offer our workshops online. Next slide, please. So our team is a group of women from a range of countries and professions. We have 2 Bosai Shi, or certified disaster prevention specialists on our team, including our founder, Motoko Kimura, who's on the right in white. I have a background in education and I work with Yayoi in the blue floral dress in this image, a fellow educator, and we focus on the schools, the school communities and professional developments for schools, staff and teachers, and workshops for students and children. And we work with Dr. Satoko Oki, a seismologist at Keio University. She's dedicated to outreach activities for earthquake education and disaster prevention, and she supervises the content of our earthquake preparedness workshops. Next slide, please. So Wanavi Japan provides earthquake preparedness workshops to connect and reinforce the cycle of disaster preparedness. We start from personal preparedness, and then we ask participants to take the time to align their preparedness across their school, their community, their workplaces, their home life, and the members of their family. So we hold our workshops for everyone, for students, families, workplaces, and we include everyone in the cycle of preparedness. Next slide, please. So to give you an idea as to why earthquake preparedness is so important in Japan, if I could draw your eyes to this map. So this map shows all the earthquakes happening around the world at any given time. So you can see Japan, or perhaps you can't see Japan because it is almost entirely covered. 10% of the earthquakes in the world occur in Japan and 20% of major earthquakes. That means magnitude 6 and above. Next slide, please. So Japan is surrounded by 4 tectonic plates, so you can see how much stress is put on the islands of Japan. And it's because of this that seismologists say that a magnitude 7 sized earthquake can happen anywhere, anytime in Japan. So educating each person to take the right action in an emergency is an indispensable part of building a resilient society. Next slide, please. So back in 2011, 41% of international residents had never experienced an earthquake before coming to Japan. However, only 36% of municipalities and other international associations provided disaster-related information in English or other languages. So there was a huge gap in information and other support between the international and Japanese communities. WNAVI Japan works to address and bridge this gap. Since 2011, more and more information and resources have become available, and WNAVI Japan is a part of this. Just to give you an idea of the number of international residents, in the 2019 statistics, it was indicated that there were 2.93 million residents of foreign nationality registered in Japan, which is 2.3% of the population. Next slide, please. So the difficult thing about earthquakes is that you really cannot choose the time and situation in which you experience them. So it was 2:46 p.m. when the earthquake occurred on March 11th. So many students were walking home from school, parents were still working, people were traveling by train. In Japan, there is a saying, "Sonae areba urei nashi," be prepared and have no regrets. So if you are prepared, you can let go of fear. And this is why we hold our workshops. We'd like everyone to be prepared as soon as possible to be able to live confidently and comfortably in Japan. Next slide, please. So in our workshops, we go through the key 7 steps to getting prepared. Step 1, we cover how to save your life in an emergency. Steps 2, we cover the basic mechanisms of earthquakes. Steps 3, 4, and 5 covers how to react after the initial quake, how to get informed, get connected, and evacuate to a safe place. And steps 6 and 7 covers what you can do now to reduce the risk in your home, in your school, or in your workplace. So these steps form the basis of our workshops and activities, but we tailor our workshops to suit the audience from primary age students to teachers and educators and families and so on. Next slide, please. Our workshops are interactive. They get you thinking and moving, as well as being information rich and providing resources. We use a number of different techniques in our workshops to provide in-context opportunities to think and practice how to react. We use interactive quiz questions to think about all of the different places you might find yourself in the event of a disaster. And we get participants up and moving using total physical response, and we make relevant cultural connections. Just 150 years ago, Japanese people believed earthquakes were caused by a giant catfish underneath the earth. And now the catfish is considered a symbol of earthquakes and is frequently used in earthquake-related signs and icons. It's a bit of a aha moment in our workshops when people realize what they're seeing. Let me take you through some of the other materials that we use. Next slide, please. So we provide a number of resources during our workshops, including our earthquake preparedness help card. I have mine here. Everything that we cover is in our help card or our handbook. In a panic situation, it's hard to remember everything. So your help card is here to support you. Don't worry, I didn't put this on the screen upside down. This is the actual help card, and it's a free printable that you can download from the WNAVI website under resources. And it folds up origami style, of course, to the size of a credit card to fit easily into a wallet or a bag. So if you fold along those lines that you can see, it won't be upside down. Our help cards include a space to do a map drawing activity of your neighbourhood, aimed at knowing your neighbourhood and all of the support places, the resources, and the hazards around you. And it has space for all your medical and personal details and those of your family and how you plan to communicate with your family. So there's a homework activity there. And it is a quick, ready reference for all of the language that you might need. So this is your cheat sheet. Next slide, please. The dango mushi, or in English, this is sometimes called the pillbug or roly-poly, or I think maybe slater in Australia, is a type of woodlouse that characteristically rolls into a protective ball when touched. And it's because of this that it has been a symbol of disaster preparedness in Japan for many years. And it is the protective pose taught to children in the event of a disaster. This is starting from daycare and kindergarten through schooling in Japan. So you can see an image of a kindergarten children practicing this pose. Disaster resilience education is a requirement in the Japanese schools, starting as early as daycare, although the requirements do change across the schooling. If there is no place to take cover, this is the pose that we teach and practice. There is not always a desk conveniently located to hide under. Next slide, please. Dr. Oki, our advisor, developed a song and dance with her lab students. It's available on YouTube. Although currently in Japanese only, it is a great opportunity to practice the dango mushi pose and to practice taking the right action in the event of a disaster. I think this link will be emailed to you. Next slide, please. We know that learning Japanese is a difficult task, sometimes seemingly insurmountable, particularly with the complexities of the Japanese written language. And whilst Google Translate has made life easier, it is crucial to know at least some Japanese in times of a disaster. So we focus on critical Japanese phrases and characters and survival Japanese that will allow students to understand emergency instructions and act on their own in the face of a major disaster. So we use pictographs like here to help remember the meaning and identify complex characters. This picture at the top is Karuta, which is a Japanese cultural game, very similar to Snap, that we use to help remember the characters. And this is an image from a workshop that we held actually at the Australian Embassy. We use real recordings of disaster announcements in Japanese, and we show Japanese news like this tsunami warning to pick out the key words and to take the action required, and role plays using total physical response to make it fun and interactive, and of course, build muscle memories. Since 2011, up until the Olympics, a lot more resources in English and other languages have become available, and we share this information too in our workshops. But in an emergency, there is no guarantee other languages will be available, or your phone will have enough battery to access them. Next slide, please. Bosai is the Japanese word for disaster prevention. So bo means prevention and sai means disaster. So one of the activities that we do is to create your own personal bosai kit. This is to carry with you on a daily basis. We talk about must-have items, we talk about useful items, and we talk about comfort items for mental health. And we talk about capacity, of course. We can't carry a huge backpack wherever we go. So this moves into the different types of kits that you might have: personal bosai, a grab and go backpack, and supplies at home or at school. Next slide, please. One of the other services that we provide are translation services, in particular around disaster resilience education. So we've translated these kamishibai created by Dr. Fuji and his lab from Shizuoka University. So these kamishibai are a traditional style of storytelling in Japan. They are story cards with the image on one side and the story to be read by the storyteller on the back. So these stories are aimed at teaching kindergarten to primary age students about earthquake preparedness and tsunami, and are an additional resource that we have in our toolkit now. They are currently used in Bosai education packages from kindergarten to high school around Japan, and they have been translated to be used in other countries around the world. There is a link for the Japanese version with English subtitles, which will be shared with you later on. And the English version is currently being developed. Next slide, please. So earthquake preparedness doesn't end with our workshops, it starts with them. So we leave our participants with a to-do list to get connected, to get informed, and to get prepared. The benefits of disaster resilience education can't always immediately be seen, but the impact of disaster resilience education can be illustrated by the story of the Kamaishi miracle. So when hit by the magnitude 9 earthquake in 2011, the action taken by the children and youth of Kamaishi in Iwate Prefecture resulted in lives being saved. The students knew immediately that they needed to evacuate to higher ground, and they pushed the adults around them to take action. So this story isn't really a miracle. It is the result, the direct result of disaster resilience education. And we hope that Wenavi Japan is a part of this. Next slide, please. Thank you so much for allowing me to present today and share our role in disaster resilience education. I hope this gave you some insight into what disaster resilience education looks like in Japan. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Beth. There are so many parts of your presentation that I would love to dive more deeply into, whether it's the astounding percentage of earthquakes that occur in Japan. I had no idea that it was so high compared to the rest of the world, or the requirement for students and curriculum to cover disaster resilience education, which is just amazing, and providing that local context. There's so much, and I noticed that there's a question in the chat bar from Belinda, but unfortunately we haven't got time. We do have to move on, but thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us, and we look forward to hopefully hearing from you again at another event down the track. So thank you so much, Beth.
Thank you very much.
I would now like to welcome our next two presenters. We have Chris Anderson from the Bushfire Recovery Program Clinical Coordinator for Royal Far West, and Oliver White, the Head of Advocacy and Government Relations at UNICEF Australia, who will today be discussing the case for bushfire resilience in our children in the context of increasingly frequent and intense disasters. Thank you very much, Chris and Oliver.
Thanks for the introduction, Owen, and hello everyone. It's nice to be with you today. I want to start by sharing with you the words of kids at Cobargo Public School. We fought hard, but we lost our stock. We fought hard, but we lost our farms. We fought hard, but we lost our homes. We fought hard, but we lost our families. This would forever be known as the day she stole the sun. These words are from the book of the same name, written by the kids in grade 5 and 6 at Cobargo Public School last year. The book is a reminder that children also have a story to tell about disasters, and they need to be included and supported in the recovery process. Our bushfire recovery program is helping to do this. Today, Oliver and I will provide a brief snapshot of the program. I'll talk about the impact of disasters on children and what our agencies have done to respond to the Black Summer bushfires. I'll then hand over to Oliver, who will talk about how we're using the program to advocate for change at a broader level. Unfortunately, we won't have time to cover everything, but we're more than happy to follow up any questions. So please feel free to get in contact over email. Next slide, please. To start, we would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land and sea. We recognise the close relationships between Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples and the lands on which they have lived for thousands of years. We pay respect to elders past, present and emerging. We would also like to acknowledge all those who have a lived experience of the Black Summer bushfires and other disasters. Many of you joining us online right now. We have seen firsthand the courage and strength in these communities and the ongoing efforts to maintain and grow this each day. For this reason, communities are the experts of their own community. Next slide, please. UNICEF Australia and Royal Far West are two charities which have been around for a long time. UNICEF have the international expertise in responding to disasters. Royal Far West have the long-standing relationships with regional and rural communities. With many of these communities, the ones that were impacted by the Black Summer bushfires. Our organisations are united by a common goal of giving children a voice, and this is why we partnered to deliver a bushfire recovery program. Next slide, please. So how do disasters affect children? We needed to understand this before we could deliver a program. One of the first steps taken in early 2020 was a literature review commissioned by the Spinifex Network and co-authored by Charles Sturt University and Royal Far West. The review investigated the impact of bushfire events on the well-being of children living in rural and remote Australia and sought to identify which interventions led to better outcomes. The review was published in the Medical Journal of Australia in December 2020, and you can see the key findings on the slide. I imagine the first two findings here wouldn't come as any surprise. However, the third finding regarding the delayed impact is important to highlight, especially as time continues to pass since the bushfires and the focus has shifted to other challenges such as COVID. It is also important to know that disasters have a greater impact for vulnerable children. This might not be surprising, but what is really striking is the level of pre-existing vulnerabilities for children in regional and remote communities, the very communities which are often impacted by disasters such as drought, bushfires, floods. Data from the Australian Early Development Census shows that children living in very remote areas are twice as likely as those living in major cities to be developmentally vulnerable. This could be in relation to their physical health, emotional maturity, cognitive skills, or another key area of development. So when disasters hit these communities, they essentially face double disadvantage. Another key finding here in the review was that no evidence-based interventions for supporting children in Australia following bushfires were identified. So more intervention research is needed, and hopefully that is something our program can help with, as it has been evaluated by Charles Sturt University. Next slide, please. So what have we done to respond? We undertook a needs assessment, which involved consulting with communities, as well as considering the extent and severity of the bushfire damage across LGAs, and also the pre-existing vulnerabilities of children in these communities. That way we could focus our efforts in the locations of greatest need. We then came up with the following service model based on input from communities, a model focusing on children 0 to 12 years, but also those key adults around the child. By supporting and upskilling the trusted adults, we give the best chance of recovery continuing into the future. For example, a teacher knowing when a student might have delayed trauma reactions down the track and knowing how to help. A range of psychosocial support is offered through the program, which allows the school or preschool community to choose what is most helpful to them. We call it a menu of options. The options range from group work and individual therapy with children, focusing on building their resilience, to support sessions with educators and parents based on building strategies. The support is provided by a multidisciplinary health team, and this has been crucial to ensuring that no child is left behind. For example, speech pathologists have adapted the content to ensure it suits children with speech and language delays, so they too have an opportunity to share their experience and stories. The program is delivered both on the ground during community visits and via technology. This hybrid model has so far proved very effective. We can build relationships in person and then carry this forward with regular online telecare delivery, ensuring children do not miss out simply based on where they live. If a family doesn't have internet access at home, we can provide this therapy through school. Next slide, please. This slide provides a bit more information about what is offered in the program and the feedback from communities, including interim evaluation findings with the full report to be released soon. For example, the children's groups have helped support 968 children, with 20% of these children identifying as Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander. The groups are based on the Stormbirds program by Good Grief and Birdie's Tree Resources by Queensland Health. The groups give children an opportunity to share their stories and feelings and to learn strategies to support their recovery. We've been co-facilitating the Stormbirds groups alongside teachers and local services who were also trained. At one school, a teacher was apprehensive about facilitating their first group, so was pleased to hear about the co-facilitation model. This teacher has now gone on to facilitating several groups of their own and also supporting other newly trained teachers in running their first groups. Evaluation is showing that the groups are supporting children to, one, understand that the reactions are normal. As one child put it, my feelings matter. And two, develop skills for coping, problem solving, and decision making. With one child saying, I know what I can do now when I'm feeling worried. You can also see on the slide the type of support we are offering to educators and parents and carers, as well as their feedback. I just want to jump over to the telecare therapy. As I mentioned earlier, the literature review highlighted that disasters such as bushfires have a greater impact for vulnerable children. So the program has prioritised those children with additional and complex needs, such as developmental delays, disabilities, or complex trauma. These pre-existing vulnerabilities can make children's recovery even more challenging, and they need support tailored to their individual needs. We've been engaging these children and their parents and carers in speech, psychology, and occupational therapy to address their underlying needs so they have a better chance to process their experience of the bushfires and follow a path of recovery. Next slide, please. I'll hand over to Oliver now, who will talk about how we're using the program to advocate for change at a broader level.
Thanks, Chris, and good afternoon, everyone. So this afternoon, I'm going to quickly run through some of the key insights and recommendations which are outlined in our advocacy report after the disaster, Recovery for Australia's Children, which we co-authored with Royal Far West with the support of Dr. Margaret Morton. But before I do, I'd like to share with you why and how UNICEF Australia has joined forces with Royal Far West to advocate for a stronger focus on children in disaster preparedness, response, and recovery. Advocating for the best interests of children to governments is core to UNICEF's mission around the world. Too frequently, we see that children are overlooked or neglected in a range of policy areas which impact their lives. Our approach to advocacy is grounded in knowledge, data, and evidence, which we then use to influence policy, practice, legislation, and budgets. Our focus is always on systems change so that we can have the biggest impact for as many children as possible, but always keeping a focus on the most marginalized and disadvantaged. Our partnership with Royal Far West has allowed us to combine local knowledge, quality data, and evidence with insights and learnings from our global work, resulting in the co-creation of this strong domestic advocacy agenda for Australian children. So what have we learned in terms of research and evidence? Well, it's essential that governments and organisations that support children have an evidence-based understanding of the impact of emergency events on children's development and well-being. It's also essential that we have an evidence-based understanding about what constitutes an effective intervention. Through our research, we found that there was a limited evidence base on what constitutes an effective intervention. That's why we're calling for more research to understand the needs and voice of children and the interventions and responses that most support them, particularly those who are affected by trauma and disadvantage. What did we learn about policy and frameworks? Well, unfortunately, Australia does not have one cohesive national policy statement or framework designed to support children and their resilience in the face of increasing complexity in the modern world. This includes disasters and large-scale emergencies. The Disaster Resilience Education for Young People Handbook, which we heard about earlier, is a great addition to help guide policy settings. But there's a need, there's an increasingly desperate need for child-focused policies, frameworks, programs, and resources to understand children's experiences of disasters and trauma and to support strong outcomes for children in the short term and across their life cycle. That's why we're calling for governments to commission a review of relevant policies and frameworks that guide disaster planning, response, and recovery efforts to ensure that the unique needs of children are specifically identified and addressed. And then we'd like to see the development in partnership of children, child and youth focused policies and frameworks to address all stages of a child's development, the multiple determinants of disadvantage, and all phases of disaster. And what are our insights on investing in children? The evidence for early investment in children's health, education, and development is clear. And as such investments benefit and compound throughout a child's lifetime for their future children and for society as a whole. That's why we're supporting calls for long-term, community-based, child-centered interventions and strategies. This includes the active involvement of children in decision-making at all stages of the emergency management cycle. We also support calls for consultation and engagement with children and funding for school-based post-disaster recovery interventions. We also gleaned insights which re-emphasize the importance of taking a local community-based approach. There's a great deal of pressure on small communities to support locally affected families and community members before, during, and after emergencies. Many communities feel overwhelmed by offers of support and a lack of coordination. This places pressure on a small number of community-based services and leaders to ensure that that coordination happens locally. This is exhausting and unsustainable in the long term. The inevitable fatigue for key community members is an issue that requires attention and support. That's why we're recommending investments which help strengthen the coordination of local systems and services and boost the capacity for them to respond, and for increased investments in school-based disaster resilience programs, which are important as they focus on social and emotional learning, which we know helps mitigate disaster-related mental health impacts and poor educational outcomes. Approaches built from these elements create reinforcing and sustainable support systems in local communities, with parents, caregivers, teachers, and services more able to support children and greater awareness and skills, leading to increased self-esteem and long-term health and well-being outcomes. If these are recommendations align with what you or your organisation would like to see, then we'd very much love to hear from you. We're keen to work in partnership and coalition with others who would like to see a stronger focus on children in disaster preparedness, response, and recovery. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Oliver, and thank you, Chris. It's wonderful to hear the work that both of your organisations are doing, and I'm sure, Oliver, that you will be inundated with messages from, apologies, my video seems to have just had a bit of an issue there, but I'm sure you'll be inundated with people inviting you to work with them. So thank you very much. There we go. My video should be working now. Apologies for that. Unfortunately, again, we are very tight for time, so we do need to move on to our next presenter. I'd like to welcome Catherine Walker, the Regional Manager for New South Wales for Water Modelling Solutions. and she today will be discussing connecting the dots between community flood education and advancing women in STEM. So thank you very much, Catherine, and over to you.
Thanks, Owen. Can you hear me there? Yeah, all good. Well, hello, it's wonderful to be part of today's discussion, and I'd like to really thank AIDR for inviting me to present. It's really great to hear about all the initiatives going on, and I'm excited to bring forward this idea of the role of science, technology, engineering and maths in the DRE space. I'm coming to you from the traditional lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation up in Sydney, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. Next slide, please. I'd also like to start my presentation with a brief shout out to all the teachers on the call, principals, educators. You are doing an amazing job. You do anyway, but especially like to acknowledge your extra effort that's going into keeping classes going during lockdown, especially here in Sydney and Melbourne and across New South Wales and the world more broadly. Look, I'm in the corporate world, and the worst I'm dealing with is people saying circle back too often and forgetting they're on mute. So you guys are doing amazingly. Okay, next slide. So to introduce what I do, I'm a flood engineer. I run a small team of flood engineers, and we essentially set up flood models where we take some topographic data, pop some rainfall on it, see where the water goes. So we can create some awesome maps. We can work out flood depths, flood levels, velocities, hazard, all sorts of things like that. We check the models work well by trying to reproduce historic events that have actually been observed in communities. And once they're calibrated well, we can then run theoretical events. So like your 1% AEP event. So that's a flood with a 1% chance of happening any given year. Also used to be called the 1 in 100 year ARI event. So out of that, we give these outputs to local councils. They're the main recipient of this information. They can use that to work out the best land use planning for their town. So that might be the best place to open up some new land for new subdivisions, and the parts of the town that might be more suited to having some sports fields or even like commercial or warehouse type land uses to keep people out of the floodplains. We also give this information to emergency services, particularly hazard classifications and the maps that show the parts of the town that might be prone to being isolated during a flood, and the areas where emergency services need to focus their efforts. So whether that's sandbagging or some extra evacuation assistance, we can help plan for that. Now, the part that I think we can do better is getting this information to the community. And that's something I'll be discussing today. So if we go to the next slide, I realise very much that I'm preaching to the choir here, but we know that communities that are more aware of their flood risk, and indeed any natural hazard risk, are far more resilient. They're far more able to prepare for, respond to and recover from those events. And so that's something I'm particularly passionate about, is getting this flood education, flood information out to the communities via schools and engaging with school students. And we know we've got a really important role to play in this space, not just for flooding, but bushfires, all sorts of natural hazards. So when you think about getting things into the school classroom, there's a whole lot of challenges that come up, but there's a few opportunities as well. So next slide. So if we talk about the STEM component of this idea, so it's science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. Pop over to the next slide, and we've got all sorts of STEM topics are encompassed in floodplain risk management. We've got technology such as gauges, we've got the telemetry and telecommunications that go with getting information from gauge sources to users, people who do flood forecasting, all of the modelling technology, hydraulics, hydrology. Oh, there's just so many things. There's something for everyone, and this brings up a multitude of opportunities to incorporate flood education into the maths and science classrooms. So that's sort of why some of these opportunities are coming up. If we think about getting into science classrooms, just pop over to the next slide. We can start thinking more about what are some of the benefits this might bring about for girls and for women in STEM. Next slide, please. So why are we even talking about this? You know, I'm sure most of you are aware there's a bit of an underrepresentation of women in the STEM fields. So what are the current stats? At the moment, women make up about 12% of the overall engineering workforce, and only 17% of first year engineering students are women. So why is this the case? There's a few reasons, but now I'm pleased to say we've got plenty of literature to completely shut down the idea that boys are simply better at science than girls. We've got plenty of research now that shows that there's no difference in achievement in those STEM topics between children, between boys and girls at around age 9. And so when students get to about year 4, that's when we start seeing a bit more of a difference. So at age 13, there's a bit more of a difference in achievement, and then a really large difference in achievement in STEM subjects between boys and girls at around the age of 17. So what's driving this trend? It's something we need to understand. And I suppose that key level of year 4 is when we start creating our own identities. And what we find are that there's just a lack of female role models for young girls to identify with. So some of the biggest misconceptions are that STEM fields are just a better fit for males because that's what we can see. And that's one of the biggest barriers to girls continuing with their STEM subjects. And these are exacerbated by the fact that girls are less likely than boys to receive specific encouragement to continue with those subjects. I saw this myself when I was in year 12. There were 3 whole physics classes, so probably about 75, 80 students all up, and only 3 of us were girls. 2 of us were in one class, 1 was in another, and there was a whole class where it was completely normal for boys to never see another girl in the room. So just wonder what flow-on effect that has for the corporate world, where it's quite normal to never see another girl in that boardroom. So why does it even matter? Why do we need more women in STEM? There's 3 main reasons, and I'll just go through those quickly. The first is that STEM fields are going to be one of the biggest fields for safe and productive employment, both now and into the future. That's where there's going to be some great jobs. And we want women to be able to access those opportunities for employment. Secondly, we know that diversity is incredibly important for innovation. Having lots of different backgrounds at the table means you've got different ideas coming through, and it's demonstrated to have better outcomes for the bottom line. So there's a business incentive to have diversity in your teams, not just gender diversity, but all sorts of diversity. And the third reason, thinking more globally, is that we've got some big problems ahead of us. Climate change, pandemics, you know, we've got these sustainable development goals we're aiming to fix. We are going to need strong teams of from diverse backgrounds that can think and innovate and come up with some new solutions to these massive problems that we're facing. Okay, so if we think about what motivates women in STEM, and I guess the key thing to note here for you teachers is that those individual pieces of encouragement are a huge motivator. The little you know, comments on the side at the end of class or in passing in the hallway, they don't go unheard. And I can still remember a few specific teachers, just like a quiet word on the side, really made me seriously consider taking up engineering. So I really encourage you in those. You might never see the fruits of those comments, but definitely keep it up. But I guess more broadly, we can see that a key motivator for women in STEM is when we can see the social impact of the science and technology side of things. And some of the stats to back this up are showing up on the screen, where we've got 12% of the broader Australian engineering workforce are women. But if you look at the membership of Engineers Without Borders, who have a really strong social impact side, we've got nearly 4 times as many women participating in that kind of activity. And that is really why I became an engineer, because I thought, yeah, I'll join Engineers Without Borders and I'll be able to directly impact some communities by using the maths and science that I'm interested in. So next slide. I guess an added benefit of involving the STEM in disaster resilience education There's a whole bunch really, but the two that I can think of now are giving some real life examples to things that are coming up in the classroom. I'm sure many teachers on the line can relate to students wondering, when am I ever going to use this in real life? Next time you need to do probability and statistics, you can, bring up the likelihood of experiencing a flood event as a real life example. The other benefit I can see is I wonder what impact we can have on safety campaigns if we bring the science along with the messaging. So the key example I've got up there is, we know that the main killer on Australian roads or during flood events is still people driving into floodwaters. We've got some great campaigns, and I just wonder how much we could boost those if students, who are potentially coming up to getting their Ps, were learning about how a culvert's put together, what forces are eroding the subs, those sub-layers of the road when there's a flood. Why does a car become buoyant in very shallow water if that's fast flowing? So I think understanding the science behind some of these dangers could really boost how much more seriously we take them. And, when that 17-year-old boy gets to the culvert and his mates are cheering him on to drive through it, he might just have that bit more understanding of why it's so deadly to go forward into those floodwaters. So we're getting to the end here, but I think what we can see is that there's a few ideas on the table here. So flood education and STEM, I think, go hand in hand. And we know when we've got STEM topics and a community element, that becomes quite appealing to girls. So we should all be collaborating in this space, is essentially my take home. Now, this topic was presented recently at the Floodplain Managers Australia conference. And if you go to the next slide. So I put forward a bit of a call to action, and we developed a small working group of consultants and some council staff. And we started thinking, look, it's not like a radical idea. There's already lots of resources out there for lesson plans that can slot into science subjects. Ada's got some great ones as well. But as a consultant, we're not coming across that many councils or schools that are using these. And so we're interested in knowing what's out there. As teachers, what are you already using? How can we make them easier for you? What can we do to improve the uptake? So we're putting together a bit of a review of what resources are out there. And we're also looking at other opportunities for professionals to get into schools, particularly through the careers pathways, and come and present to students as a way to, inspire more girls to stick with science subjects as they move through schools. So just go one more. My last slide is another bit of a call to action. Scan the QR code. It's definitely the year for it. And we're keen to understand, who you are, what you're already doing in this space, and see where the gaps are, and maybe what is it that a group of consultants in this space can assist with. So if you want to take a screenshot, scan it later, scan and come back to it another time, that would be really good. And we'll also set up a bit of a mailing list so you can see how we progress with this project. That's it from me. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Catherine. I can definitely empathise as a student quite a while ago, thinking about where can I join these statistics, these maths classes into real world applications. So it's amazing to see you sort of working in implementing those real world applications to these important topics. And unfortunately, again, we're running behind time, so we do have to move on quickly. So thank you. And I will introduce our final, but by no means least, last but no means least speakers for the day. Dr. Bryony Towers, founder and co-director of LEADER, Learning Ecologies for Action on DRR and Resilience, and Lee Johnson, principal at Harkaway Primary School. They will be discussing learner agency in bushfire education, an exploratory case study from Harkaway Primary School, Victoria. Over to you, Lee and Bryony.
Thank you, Owen. Lee and I will be talking today, but we also have some very special guests who will be joining us. So I know we're supposed to finish it at 1 p.m, but I highly recommend that you stick around because we have something quite special to share with you. So let me just start here. Okay. So thank you so much for having us, and thank you to all of the presenters for their fascinating presentations. It's such an exciting time to be working in this field, and we're really lucky to have the DRANZSEN Forum to provide a platform for sharing all of this amazing research and practice. So thank you. I'm on beautiful Woiwurrung country today. I'd like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri people as the traditional custodians of this land, and I pay my respects to Wurundjeri elders past and present. Sovereignty was never ceded. I would also like to pay my respects to the First Nations children and young people all over the world who are fighting to protect the land, air and water that sustains us. I want to start by emphasising that the importance of educating children about bushfire safety has been recognised for over 80 years. After the 1939 Black Friday fires in Victoria, Judge Stretton suggested that in every school, fire prevention should be made a real part of the curriculum, and that the lessons in that behalf should be given at the commencement of the summer season. Since then, recommendations relating to children's bushfire education have been made in every major bushfire Royal Commission and formal inquiry. In the final report of the 2009 Victorian Bushfires Royal Commission, which followed the Black Saturday bushfires, the commissioners lamented that those recommendations had never been fully implemented. In their report, recommendation 6 required that Victoria lead an initiative to ensure that the national curriculum incorporates the history of bushfire in Australia, and that the existing curriculum areas include elements of bushfire education. And in 2014, 75 years after Judge Stretton's initial recommendation, bushfire education was included in the Australian curriculum. So now in grade 5 humanities and social sciences, the learning strand for geography includes this content description: the impact of bushfire or floods on environments and communities and how people can respond. There are also content elaborations that provide suggestions for how teachers can implement that content in their classrooms. For the last 5 years, as part of our Bushfire and Natural Hazards Cooperative Research Centre project on building best practice in child-centred disaster risk reduction, we have been researching and evaluating the implementation of that grade 5 geography curriculum in Australian schools. We have been unbelievably fortunate to conduct our research with the most incredible educators, emergency management practitioners and children as they navigate the highly complex domain of school-based bushfire education. I especially want to acknowledge Lisa O'Brien and Jane Haywood, who run the Strathewen Arthurs Creek Bushfire Education Partnership, Jamie McKenzie and Emma Taunt from the Anglesea Survive and Thrive program, and Liz Addison and Ruth Noonan at the Western Australian Department of Fire and Emergency Services. And while we didn't conduct any formal research on the RFS Firestorm project, we've been very lucky to learn from the lead architect of that program, Barbara Ryan, who was at St Ives Primary School at the time that that program was designed, and her co-conspirator, Tony Jarrett, formerly of the RFS and now a PhD scholar at CQU. Across all of these programs and initiatives, our research has identified a myriad of mechanisms and processes that underpin effective bushfire education. But the one that really stands out as absolutely fundamental is learner agency. So what is learner agency? There's no universally accepted definition, but we really like this one from the OECD's Learning Compass. Learner agency implies a sense of responsibility as students participate in society and aim to influence people, events, and circumstances for the better. Agency requires the ability to frame a guiding purpose and identify actions to achieve a goal. It is about acting rather than being acted upon, shaping rather than being shaped, and making responsible decisions and choices rather than accepting those determined by others. So in the final stages of our VNHCRC project, my dear colleague, Kevin Ronan, and I wanted to go deep into learner agency so that we could increase our understanding of what it looks like in the context of bushfire education, what the benefits are, and how we can create learning ecologies that promote it. And to investigate these questions, we couldn't have found a better research partner than Harkaway Primary School, which is located on the bushfire-prone peri-urban interface of Melbourne's southeastern suburbs. When I emailed Principal Lee Johnson to see if he might be interested in working with us, he responded with, "This is music to my ears. Anything that gives our kids a sense of agency in bushfire safety, we're in." As researchers, Kevin and I felt like we'd won the lottery. For this case study, it involved 40 grade 5-6 students, and we decided to adopt a project-based learning approach, which is widely recognised as affording a high degree of learner agency. So consistent with good practice in project-based learning, the process began with an exploration of the various factors that contribute to bushfire risk, and the students were challenged to ask a multitude of questions. In small groups, they then identified a local problem of concern, planned their inquiries, collected and compiled information, reflected on their findings, designed a solution, and shared that solution with a broader audience of vested interest. Throughout that process, we used ethnographic research methods, focus groups, semi-structured and informal interviews, and participant observation to gather data on the learning process from the perspectives of students and their teachers. Upon completion of the unit, key findings were shared and validated with the students in a participatory workshop. So what did we learn about learner agency in bushfire education? As I was analysing and interpreting our data, I found that it mapped really nicely onto Laura Lundy's model of participation, which consists of 4 components. Space relates to the importance of providing a safe and inclusive space for children to form a view. Voice relates to the importance of creating opportunities for children to express their views. Audience relates to ensuring that children's views are communicated to someone who has the responsibility to listen. And influence relates to ensuring children's views are listened to and acted upon as appropriate. And you'll see there, for each of those components, I've developed some questions that we can ask ourselves when we are seeking to design and implement bushfire education that affords learner agency. So take a screenshot if you're interested in looking at those, because I'm going to keep moving on. But what do children think about all of this? How do they conceptualise learner agency? When we were finishing up our case study research with the class of 2020, just before COVID changed our lives forever, the children decided they wanted to write their own bushfire education manifesto. A few weeks ago, the class of 2021 ratified that manifesto, and last Thursday in our weekly Zoom hangout, they decided they wanted to turn it into a film that they could share with all of you today. In just 4 days, they recorded the voiceovers, they made the artwork, and it all came through to me in a series of about 80 text messages. I was gobsmacked by the beauty of it all. So here it is, the world premiere of Bushfire Education for Kids, a manifesto from Harkaway Primary School. Take it away, Greg.
Bushfire Education for Kids, a manifesto from Harkaway Primary School.
All of us at Harkaway Primary School would like to say thank you to the Bungarong and Wurundjeri people, tribes of the Kulin Nation, for letting us share your land. We promise to look after it, the people and the animals too.
We promise to care for the land, the sky, ourselves and each other.
We need to learn about bushfire safety. Bushfires can be very dangerous. People need to have a good understanding of bushfires and how to survive. Otherwise, when there is a bushfire, there will be more casualties and more deaths. It will be more catastrophic.
Kids also need to know what to do to be safe, and they need to learn it from a young age. When kids learn about bushfire safety from a young age, they can grow up knowing about their environment. Most people don't know about bushfires because they didn't learn about it when they were kids.
If a bushfire is happening, kids need to know what they can do so they can stay calm and help their parents, instead of the parents doing everything and the kids just going, ah! When kids know what to do, there will be more hands on deck and everyone will be safer.
We want to make decisions about our learning and action. Kids have really good ideas, and sometimes we see problems and risks that adults don't see. We also know what kind of action is possible for us to achieve at home, at schools, and in our communities. If we can make decisions about our own learning and action, we can solve real problems that matter to us.
We all learn differently and we have our own special interests and talents. When we can make decisions about our own learning and action, we can achieve more than if we are just told what to do. We also work harder to succeed because we are doing what we are good at and what we enjoy.
We also need to learn at our own pace. Learning about bushfires can be overwhelming, and sometimes we need to slow things down a bit or take a break to let it all sink in. When we learn at our own pace, we can get a better understanding of complicated information.
We need independence. We need to figure out how to learn and discover stuff on our own. We just need the adults there to guide us, put us on the right track, and help us if we get stuck. We can do the rest.
We unfortunately have to just end the video a little bit early there because we're pressed for time, but I think Lee will be taking over from Bryony now.
Fantastic. So hopefully you can hear me all there, guys, and the camera's doing its thing. It is after 1 o'clock, so I'm just going to keep it super brief, but what an extraordinary example of everything that we've been talking about today, seeing that come together. I mean, Dr. Bryony, obviously, as a role model for STEM there, another great example of what we're talking about. So the three kind of things that I would love to bring to our attention is the process, the product, and the problems that we face. I'm going to skip straight to the product and a couple of the problems in about 30 seconds. And that is, not only were the kids able to produce something like what you've just seen there, but also they were able to define things that they wanted to find out for themselves and have this complete extraordinary representation of different products. Hang on, I'm getting a call there somewhere. Yes? So I'll just keep going there. I know my video doesn't look like it's on here. I don't know what's happening there. So bottom line is our kids were making movies about how to put phone numbers on the side of your horse after speaking to a veterinary surgeon about how to do that. They were speaking to experts in the field of disaster and disability research and how to support people during evacuations. They were talking to people about what to do when it's too late to leave. We had people, developing websites yes, you there? Okay, developing websites on a go list and where you can go on days of total or catastrophic fire danger rating. Some of the problems were really around about the unknown unknowns, access to experts, and more than that, being able to connect with the experts to solve the problems and have the background knowledge that they needed to be able to resolve or identify the problems that they're trying to solve. Heaps of fantastic stuff going on. What an extraordinary event today. Thank you, Owen, for bringing that all together, and we can't wait to see where it goes from here. Cheers, everyone.
Thank you, Lee. Thank you, Bryony. Thank you, everyone. I'm going to sort of have to wrap things up very quickly because we are pressed for time. And of course, we do have the handbook launched this afternoon. So first and foremost, thank you so much to all of our presenters. We appreciate you taking the time out of your day to present to us. Thank you to everyone who's attended. Without you, the DRANZSEN network wouldn't be what it is today. So I strongly encourage you to please attend our future forums and events and continue to be a part of it and making it into such a wonderful network. Thank you to Greg and Charlotte at ADA in the events team for running everything behind the scenes. They are definitely the hamster in the wheel that keeps us all running. Thank you to Ella for managing the chat functions today, and thank you to Amanda Leck for opening up the forum today. I could go on and speak for hours about everything, but there are some amazing themes that came out of the presentations today that really linked everything together, and I think highlights the need for disaster resilience education. The common themes of young people being active, having a voice, being involved, the work being meaningful, and also a local context really came across every one of the presentations today. So I encourage you all to take away those ideas with you into your work. And I look forward to seeing you all again, hopefully not in a virtual sense, but actually in person at one of our future forums. Of course, there are the Resilient Australia Awards for 2022. We encourage you to submit applications for those awards. There are the dedicated schools award as well. So please, if you are working in a school context, please submit an application for those. If you require any more information about those, about the Resilient Australia Awards, they can be found on the AIDA website or by contacting the inquiries email at AIDA. So I hope I haven't forgotten anything at the very end as we're rushed to get everything finished, but if I have, I do apologise. And once again, thank you so much. And we look forward to seeing you again, hopefully in about 50 minutes time at the Disaster Resilience Education for Young People handbook launch. Thank you. Bye.